You expect me to believe this Rolls-Royce is yours? Step out now before this gets ugly. Officer Rourke rapped his knuckles sharply against the driver's window, the sound cutting through the gas station as Elijah Grant sat behind the wheel, engine still running. A few heads turned, then more, phones slowly rising as the tension spread. Elijah opened the door calmly and stepped out, the midday heat pressing down as Rourke immediately closed the distance, circling him with sharp, assessing eyes. "Go ahead," Rourke said louder, making sure others heard. "Explain how this is yours." Elijah didn't flinch. He reached slowly into his jacket. "Don't try anything," Rourke snapped, his tone turning colder, hand hovering near his belt. Elijah stopped just enough to meet his gaze, voice steady and controlled. "I'm a federal judge." For a split second, the air shifted, but Rourke's expression didn't. Because the man trying to put him in his place had no idea. He was challenging authority far beyond his own. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. Judge Elijah Grant stepped out of his Rolls-Royce, the midday sun beating down on the gas station. Heat rose in waves from the blacktop. His shirt already clung to his back after the long drive. He stretched, feeling the tension in his shoulders from hours behind the wheel. Before his hand even left the door handle, tires screeched against pavement. A police cruiser pulled in sharply, stopping at an angle behind his car. The officer inside stared at him with narrowed eyes, then swung the door open and stepped out. Officer Dale Rourke approached, with his hand resting on his holster, eyes never leaving Elijah. No greeting, no smile, just immediate suspicion. "How'd you get this car?" Rourke demanded, voice cutting through the quiet station. Elijah maintained his composure, years of courtroom discipline holding firm. "Good afternoon, officer. It's my vehicle. I purchased it 3 years ago." Rourke circled him like a shark, boots scraping against the pavement. "Pretty fancy ride. License and registration." "Of course," Elijah said, keeping his voice steady. A few customers pumping gas had stopped to watch. Elijah felt their eyes on him as Rourke continued circling, getting closer with each pass. "What brings you through here?" "Don't see many cars like this around." Rourke's voice grew louder, ensuring everyone could hear. "Seems out of place." "I'm returning from a conference," Elijah explained, recognizing the familiar pattern unfolding, the assumptions, the tone, the immediate suspicion that had nothing to do with his driving. "Conference, huh?" Rourke scoffed. "What kind of conference you attending in a ride like this?" Elijah took a deep breath. "A judicial conference. I'm a judge." "Sure you are," Rourke sneered. "And I'm the president." Elijah reached slowly toward his inside pocket. "My identification is—" "Hey, hands where I can see them!" Rourke shouted, jerking his hand to his weapon. "What are you reaching for?" The gas station went completely silent. A woman at the next pump clutched her child closer. "My identification," Elijah said carefully, hands now visible. "My wallet is in my jacket pocket." "Slow, very slow," Rourke ordered, his stance wide, body tense. Elijah felt sweat beading on his forehead as he carefully retrieved his wallet. The badge inside clearly showed his federal judicial credentials. "I'm a federal judge," he said clearly, holding out his ID. "Judge Elijah Grant." Rourke glanced at it, then snorted. "Nice fake. Real professional looking." "It's not fake," Elijah said, controlling his growing anger. "You can call the federal courthouse to confirm." "Oh, I'm calling all right," Rourke said, grabbing his radio. "Dispatch, I've got a possible 1029 at the Sunoco station. Subject claiming to be a federal judge. Possible stolen vehicle. Possible impersonation of a federal officer." Elijah stood perfectly still, humiliation washing over him. People were openly staring now, phones raised to record the scene. "Sir, I suggest you don't move, Rourke said loudly. Backup is on the way. This is unnecessary, Elijah said, his voice tight but measured. I've shown you proper identification. And I've determined it requires verification, Rourke shot back, unless you want to add resisting to those charges. In the distance, sirens wailed. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars pulled in, lights flashing across the station in blue and red pulses. Officers emerged with hands on their weapons. Elijah stood motionless in the growing circle of law enforcement, the heat of shame burning hotter than the summer sun. Customers watched from behind their cars and from the safety of the convenience store. As the lights flooded across the gas station, Judge Elijah Grant realized with perfect clarity that this was far from over. Moments later, multiple officers arrived, their presence turning the gas station into a spectacle under the bright midday sun. The patrol cars created a half-circle around Elijah's Rolls-Royce, their lights still flashing unnecessarily against the daylight. People pumping gas abandoned their tasks to watch. Officer Rourke strutted toward his colleagues, chest puffed with authority. He gestured toward Elijah with dismissive flicks of his wrist. Got a guy here claiming he's some federal judge, Rourke announced loudly. Driving this luxury vehicle that doesn't match his profile. Wouldn't be surprised if it's stolen. Got real defensive when I started asking questions. Elijah's jaw tightened. Not one word of that was true. A female officer approached, her expression already hardened by Rourke's briefing. Sir, please place your hands on the hood of the vehicle. This is completely unnecessary, Elijah said, his voice still controlled despite the growing knot in his stomach. I've already identified myself as Judge Elijah Grant of the Federal District Court. My credentials are— Hands on the vehicle now, the second officer demanded, her hand hovering near her holster. Elijah slowly placed his palms against the hot metal of his car hood. The heat burned against his skin, but the humiliation burned deeper. Around him, the crowd had grown. A truck driver filmed with his phone. A mother hurried her children into their minivan, casting worried glances. A teenager behind the gas station window pressed his face against the glass. Rourke circled the Rolls-Royce, whistling low. Mind if we take a look inside, Your Honor? He didn't wait for permission. He yanked open the passenger door and began rifling through the glove compartment, tossing papers onto the seat. I do not consent to a search, Elijah stated firmly. Rourke ignored him, digging deeper. Awful nice car for a public servant. Where'd you really get it, huh? Gift from a grateful defendant? The accusation stung like a slap. After 30 years on the bench, his reputation was being shredded at a gas station for everyone to see. I've worked for 40 years, Elijah said, feeling his composure crack. I saved. I bought it legally. If you would simply call the courthouse— We're doing that now, the female officer cut in, though her tone suggested she didn't believe him either. Someone from dispatch spoke through the radio. The crowd had grown to at least 15 people now, most with phones raised. Elijah could feel the weight of their stares, the assumptions being made. He'd sentenced criminals to years in prison with less discomfort than he felt in this moment. Minutes stretched painfully. The sun beat down. Sweat trickled down Elijah's back beneath his tailored suit. Finally, the radio crackled. The female officer's expression changed as she listened to the voice on the other end. She shot a look at Rourke, who was still searching through Elijah's luggage in the trunk. Rourke, she called sharply. Dispatch confirms. He's legit. A heavy silence fell. Rourke straightened slowly, his face flushing not with embarrassment, but irritation. He slammed the trunk closed with unnecessary force. You can take your hands off the car, he told Elijah, not meeting his eyes. No apology. No explanation. The female officer stepped back, suddenly finding something fascinating to look at in the distance. Just a misunderstanding, sir, she mumbled. You're free to go." The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others whispering. As Elijah straightened his suit jacket with as much dignity as he could muster, he felt someone brush against him. A young man in a baseball cap pressed something cold and metallic into his palm. "Keep this. You'll need it," he whispered, then walked away without looking back. Elijah glanced down. In his hand was a phone, not his own. Elijah sat back in his car, hands trembling slightly as he watched the recording, the afternoon sun still glaring through the windshield. The phone's screen showed everything in painful clarity. There he was, standing at the pump, and there was Rourke, swooping in like a predator. "How'd you get this car?" Rourke's voice rang through the small speaker, dripping with accusation. Elijah's own calm response, the escalation, the backup, his hands on the hood of his own vehicle. He paused the video, taking a deep breath. It was worse than he remembered. From this angle, he could see what he couldn't before. The smirks between officers, the casual way they violated his rights, the phones recording his humiliation. 30 years on the bench. And this is what it came to, being treated like a criminal for driving his own car. His finger hovered over the play button. He had to see it all. "I'm a federal judge." "Yeah, and I'm the president. Put your hands on the hood." The laughter from onlookers twisted in his gut. How many times had he heard stories like this in his courtroom? How many times had he given police the benefit of the doubt? When the video ended, Elijah sat motionless for a full minute. Then, with deliberate movements, he slipped the phone into his pocket, straightened his tie, and started the engine. He wasn't going home. Not yet. The local precinct was a squat brick building, American flag hanging limply in the still afternoon heat. Elijah parked in a visitor spot, noting how his Rolls-Royce stood out among the patrol cars. He wouldn't hide who he was. Not anymore. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The front desk officer, a young man with close-cropped hair, looked up with disinterest. "Can I help you?" "I need to file a complaint," Elijah said, his judicial voice returning, clear, authoritative. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of complaint?" "Regarding Officer Dale Rourke. I was unlawfully detained at a gas station approximately 1 hour ago." Something flickered across the officer's face. Recognition? Warning? He pushed a clipboard across the counter. "Fill this out. Someone will be with you." Elijah took the clipboard and sat in a hard plastic chair against the wall. The form was unnecessarily complex, full of repetitive questions and tiny spaces for answers. He filled it out with precise handwriting, noting every detail of the incident. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Officers walked by, some glancing his way. None approached. Finally, Elijah returned to the desk. "I've completed the form. Sergeant Hayes will be out shortly," the desk officer said, without looking up. Another 15 minutes dragged by. When Sergeant Hayes finally appeared, he was a bulldog of a man with salt and pepper hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Judge Grant, sorry to keep you waiting. I understand there was an incident today?" They sat in a small interview room, the complaint form between them. "I'd like to request the body cam footage from Officer Rourke," Elijah said, after explaining what happened. Hayes' smile tightened. "We'll certainly look into that. But there might be some technical issues. Our equipment isn't always reliable." "I find that hard to believe," Elijah replied, his tone level. "Your department received a substantial grant for new equipment last year. I presided over the approval." Hayes shifted in his seat. "Like I said, we'll check. These things have processes, Judge. You understand that better than most." "I do. Which is why I expect this to be handled properly." Elijah leaned forward slightly. "I'd also like to know why Officer Rourke approached me in the first place. Officers have discretion to investigate suspicious activities." What was suspicious about putting gas in my car? Hayes's expression hardened. Look, Judge, I respect your position. But our officers have difficult jobs. Sometimes mistakes happen. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern of behavior. And I intend to address it. As the conversation continued, Elijah noticed the subtle resistance. Every question met with deflection. Every request countered with procedure. This wasn't incompetence. It was strategy. We'll be in touch, Hayes finally said, standing up. These investigations take time. I expect regular updates, Elijah replied. As he walked back through the precinct, he felt eyes following him. Two officers by the water cooler fell silent as he passed. Another whispered something to his partner. The desk officer watched him with undisguised hostility. The early evening air felt cool compared to the stifling atmosphere inside. Long shadows stretched across the parking lot as Elijah walked to his car. A patrol vehicle drove slowly past him, the officer inside making deliberate eye contact. Elijah paused, key in hand. His courthouse was only 20 minutes from here. He'd passed this precinct hundreds of times, sat in meetings with their chief, reviewed their cases. And yet, in all those years, he'd never truly seen what was happening. The realization settled on him like a weight. What happened at the gas station wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't one bad officer having a power trip. It was a system protecting itself, closing ranks against outsiders, even those who should have been allies. He looked back at the precinct building, seeing it with new eyes. How many complaints had been filed here, only to disappear into bureaucratic limbo? How many citizens had walked away, knowing that justice wasn't available to them? Elijah slid into his car, the leather seat no longer feeling like the comfort it once was. The phone with the video evidence sat heavy in his pocket. For the first time in his career, he found himself on the other side of the system he'd served, and it was a cold, intimidating place to be. That same evening, Elijah sat on the edge of the hotel bed, his tie loosened and jacket discarded. The room's lamp cast long shadows across the walls as daylight faded outside. His fingers hovered over his phone for a moment before dialing. Despite the comfort of the upscale hotel, tension clung to him like a second skin. Lydia answered on the second ring. "Dad? Everything okay?" "No," Elijah said, his voice tired. "Something happened today." He recounted everything. The gas station, Officer Rourke's immediate hostility, the backup, the humiliation. The words came out measured and precise, just as he'd deliver facts in court. But unlike court, his voice occasionally wavered. "They surrounded me like I was dangerous," he said. "Searched my car without consent. Implied I stole it." "Jesus, Dad," Lydia's voice tightened. "Are you hurt?" "Not physically." "Did you get badge numbers? Names?" "Rourke. The others? No. But—" Elijah paused. "Someone recorded it. Gave me their phone." The line went quiet for a moment. When Lydia spoke again, her voice had changed. Sharper. Focused. This was Lydia, the attorney, now. "I've seen this pattern in half my civil rights cases, Dad. The profiling, the escalation, the cover-up after. This isn't new. It's just new to you." "I filed a complaint at the precinct," Elijah said. Lydia scoffed. "And let me guess. They were less than helpful? They said the body cam footage might have technical issues." "Of course they did." Her voice hardened. "Dad, you can't let this go. They need to be held accountable." "I don't intend to let it go," Elijah said, looking down at the stranger's phone in his hand. "I've seen too many people walk into my courtroom claiming police misconduct. I've heard too many departments claim a few bad apples." "Send me the video," Lydia said. "Right now." Elijah forwarded the file, then put his phone on speaker. He could hear Lydia's controlled breathing as she watched. "This is textbook harassment," she finally said. "Unlawful detention. Illegal search." And look at Rourke's face when you mention you're a judge. Not surprise, Dad. Fear. He's afraid of who you are, because he knows what he's doing is wrong. Elijah stood and paced across the hotel carpet. I counted at least 7 procedural violations. I counted 9, Lydia said. But here's the thing. You won't get anywhere filing locally. They protect their own. I know the chief. Dad, stop. This isn't about knowing people. This is systemic. We need to file a federal complaint. The word "we" hung in the air. Elijah looked out the window at the darkening sky. You don't have to get involved. I'm already involved, Lydia said firmly. I'm coming down tomorrow morning. Elijah sank into the desk chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 58 years. There's something else bothering me, Lydia. What? I've presided over dozens of cases from this jurisdiction, accepted testimony from these officers, handed down sentences based on their arrests. The silence stretched between them. If they treat a federal judge this way in broad daylight? Elijah's voice trailed off. Then what are they doing to everyone else? Lydia finished his thought. And how many cases were built on the same kind of misconduct? Elijah closed his eyes. Exactly. This goes beyond one bad traffic stop, doesn't it? Lydia's voice was gentle now, understanding the weight of what her father was realizing. I sentenced people based on their testimony, Elijah said. I believed them because they wore badges. Dad, you followed the law as it was presented to you. And if the evidence was tainted from the start? If the arrests were unlawful? He pressed his fingers against his temples. How many lives did I affect based on corrupt police work? We'll figure this out, Lydia said. I'll be there by 9 tomorrow. We'll go through everything. Your past cases with this department, this incident, all of it. It won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. Her voice softened. Try to get some sleep, Dad. Tomorrow, we fight back. After they hung up, Elijah sat alone in the growing darkness. He picked up the stranger's phone and played the video again. The screen's blue glow illuminated his face as he watched himself being surrounded, questioned, searched. For 30 years, he'd viewed the world from behind the bench. Orderly, procedural, fair. Now he saw it from the other side, where procedures were weapons and fairness was a luxury. He paused the video on Officer Rourke's face, the contempt clear in his eyes, the casual power in his stance. One officer, one department, one incident. But the implications stretched much further. How many others had faced this treatment without cameras recording? Without federal credentials to protect them? Without the resources to fight back? Elijah Grant had built his career upholding the system. Now, he wondered if that system was broken at its core. The morning sun filtered through the thin hotel curtains as a sharp knock sounded at Elijah's door. He opened it to find Lydia standing there, coffee carrier in one hand, thick folder tucked under her arm. You look like you didn't sleep, she said, studying his face. I didn't. Elijah stepped aside to let her in. Too many thoughts. Lydia placed the coffee on the desk and surveyed the room. Elijah had converted it into a makeshift investigation center. Legal pads covered the bed. His laptop was open on the desk. I brought fuel. She handed him a cup. Black, no sugar. Just how you like it. Thanks. He took a sip, letting the bitter warmth spread through him. Lydia shrugged off her blazer, revealing a simple white blouse. I've been up since 5 pulling records. She opened her folder and spread papers across the desk. These are complaints filed against this department over the past 3 years. How many? Elijah asked, leaning in. 57. Lydia's voice was tight. Want to guess how many resulted in disciplinary action? Elijah's jaw clenched. How many? 3. All minor infractions, all resolved with additional training. She made air quotes with her fingers. And those are just the official complaints. I found forum posts, community meeting minutes, people talking about problems with this department for years. Elijah pulled his laptop closer. I compiled a list of cases from this jurisdiction that came before my bench. He turned the screen toward her. 23 cases in the past 5 years. Lydia scanned the list. Did you notice any patterns at the time? Nothing that raised flags. They seemed like standard cases. Drug possession, assault, theft. The evidence was always solid. Testimonies consistent. Elijah rubbed his eyes. But now you're seeing it differently. Lydia nodded. Let's cross-reference. See if any officers involved in those complaints were also involved in cases you presided over. For the next hour, they worked methodically. Lydia read names from complaints while Elijah checked his case files. They created a chart on a hotel notepad, drawing lines between names that appeared in both sets. Rourke, Elijah said, marking another connection. That's the 7th case where he was either the arresting officer or provided key testimony. Lydia leaned back in her chair. And look at this. 3 of those complaints against him were mysteriously lost in the system, only recovered when lawyers pushed hard enough. Elijah stared at their growing web of connections. Sheriff Brenner's name keeps appearing too. Not directly involved in arrests, but signing off on reports, vouching for his officer's conduct. Dad, look at this. Lydia spread out several police reports side by side. The language is almost identical in how they describe finding evidence. In plain view on the passenger seat. Clearly visible through the vehicle window. It's like they're working from a template. Elijah's face darkened. That's not just lazy report writing. That's deliberate. If evidence is in plain view, they don't need a warrant, Lydia finished. Convenient pattern, isn't it? Elijah picked up his coffee, now cold. We're talking about dozens of arrests, Lydia. Potentially hundreds of civil rights violations. And years of sentences handed down based on this evidence. Lydia met his eyes. I know what you're thinking, Dad. This isn't on you. Before Elijah could respond, a soft sound caught their attention. Something sliding under the door. They both froze. Lydia moved first, walking carefully to the door. A white envelope lay on the carpet. She looked through the peephole but saw only an empty hallway. Someone was just here. She picked up the envelope. No name, no markings. Elijah joined her. Open it. Inside were photocopies of police reports. Internal versions, not the ones filed with the court. Sections were highlighted in yellow. These are altered, Elijah said, comparing them to the official reports from his cases. Look at the timestamps. The official report says they discovered evidence at 9:15 p.m. This internal one says 10:40 p.m., after they'd already detained the suspect for over an hour. And here, Lydia pointed to another document. The search location is different. They didn't find it in plain view at all. They searched without consent, then changed the report. Someone inside the department sent these. Elijah shuffled through the papers. Someone who knows what's happening and wants it exposed. The last page wasn't a report, but a handwritten note. Not just Rourke. System goes to the top. More coming. Lydia looked up at her father, her expression a mixture of shock and determination. Dad, this isn't about your traffic stop anymore. No. Elijah carefully arranged the new documents alongside their growing evidence pile. It's about exposing something much bigger. They stared at each other across the hotel desk, the weight of what they'd discovered settling between them. What had started as a personal injustice was revealing itself as something far more sinister. A corrupt system that had been operating unchecked for years, with real victims and real consequences. And someone on the inside wanted them to know. Late morning sunlight streamed through the hotel window as Elijah and Lydia pored over the anonymous documents. The pile had grown, spreading across the desk in organized chaos. Coffee cups sat empty beside them. "Look at this one," Lydia said, sliding a report toward her father. Driver pulled over for a broken taillight, but the body cam timestamp shows the light working when the officer first approached. Then, mysteriously, it's broken later in the report. Elijah adjusted his reading glasses. And conveniently, while checking this non-existent taillight, Officer Rourke spots drugs in plain view. Exactly. But the report times don't match. There's a 20-minute gap before the drugs were discovered. Lydia's finger traced the inconsistencies. No judge would allow this if they knew. Except judges never saw these internal reports, Elijah said quietly. Only the cleaned-up versions. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of realization settling on his shoulders. For years, he'd presided over cases, trusting the evidence presented followed proper procedure. How many people had he sentenced based on tainted evidence? "We need to contact these people," he said finally. "The ones who were convicted." Lydia nodded. "I've already made a list. There are at least 7 cases from your courtroom alone where Rourke was the arresting officer, plus another dozen from other judges, with the same pattern. Start with the most recent ones," Elijah said. "The trail will be freshest." 2 hours later, they pulled up outside a small apartment complex on the edge of town. Marcus Jefferson had been convicted 3 years ago on possession charges after a routine traffic stop. "Remember," Lydia warned as they approached his door, "he might not want to talk. These people have been through the system, and it didn't treat them well." The door opened after their second knock. A man in his 30s appeared, instantly tensing when Elijah introduced himself. "You're the judge," Marcus said flatly. "The one who gave me 18 months. "Yes, Mr. Jefferson. I'd like to talk about your arrest, if you're willing." Marcus's eyes darted between them. "Why now?" "Because we have reason to believe Officer Rourke may have violated procedure during your stop," Lydia explained. "And you might not be the only one." Marcus hesitated, then stepped back. 10 minutes. Inside, the apartment was small but neat. Marcus remained standing, arms crossed defensively. "Can you tell us about the night you were pulled over?" Elijah asked. "You know what happened. It's in the report." Marcus's voice was hard. "We want to hear your version," Lydia said gently. Marcus stared at them for a long moment. "He said my license plate light was out, but it wasn't. My cousin had just fixed it that morning." "Did you tell your lawyer that?" Elijah asked. "Yeah. He said it didn't matter. Said they had the drugs, and my word against a cop's wasn't worth fighting." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Said I'd get 5 years if I didn't take the plea." "And the drugs," Lydia pressed. "Where did Officer Rourke say he found them?" "Under the passenger seat. But they weren't mine, and they weren't there before he searched." Marcus's eyes locked onto Elijah's. "I told you that at sentencing." "You didn't believe me." Elijah felt the accusation like a physical blow. He remembered the case, another routine drug possession, another defendant claiming innocence. He'd heard it all before. "There were 4 other cases that month," he said quietly, "all with similar circumstances. I didn't see the pattern then." "And now?" Marcus's voice held both hope and skepticism. Lydia pulled out copies of the internal reports. "These suggest Officer Rourke planted evidence in multiple cases, including yours. The department covered it up." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he took the papers. "So, what happens now?" "We're building a case," Elijah said. "With enough evidence, we could potentially overturn these convictions." "You believe me now?" Marcus asked, looking directly at Elijah. "Yes," Elijah said, the single word carrying the weight of years of misplaced faith in a flawed system. "I do." They visited 2 more homes that afternoon. One door remained firmly closed. The other opened to a frightened woman, who wouldn't speak until her children left the room. Each story echoed Marcus's, minor traffic violations, questionable searches, pressure to accept pleas. The sun was beginning to set as they walked back to their car after the last visit. "This is just the beginning," Lydia said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "How many others are there?" Elijah didn't answer. His mind was on faces, people who had stood before him, insisting on their innocence while he delivered sentences based on evidence he now knew was likely fabricated. Lydia's phone buzzed. She read the message, then looked up at her father with wide eyes. "Someone from Internal Affairs wants to meet," she said. "Privately." The corner booth at Rosie's Diner felt like neutral territory. Away from courtrooms and police stations, the afternoon sun filtered through blinds, casting stripes across the worn red vinyl seats. Elijah slid in first, followed by Lydia, both facing the door. Captain Roy Keegan arrived exactly on time. He wore a pressed shirt and slacks, rather than a uniform, a deliberate choice, Elijah noted. Less intimidating, more approachable. "Judge Grant, Ms. Grant," Keegan said with a nod, sliding into the seat opposite them. His voice was smooth and measured. "Thank you for meeting me." A waitress appeared, coffee pot in hand. Keegan smiled at her. "Just black for me, thanks." Elijah ordered the same. Lydia asked for water. When the waitress left, Keegan folded his hands on the table. "I'll get right to it. There are concerns within the department that need addressing." "Concerns?" Lydia's voice had an edge. "Is that what you call what happened to my father?" Keegan's expression remained neutral. "I understand your frustration. What happened at that gas station was unacceptable." He turned to Elijah. "Judge, you should know I've been looking into Officer Rourke's conduct for some time now." Elijah studied the man across from him. Keegan's eyes were steady, his posture relaxed but attentive. A practiced calm. "Why are you telling us this?" Elijah asked. "Because I believe we might be working toward the same goal." Keegan lowered his voice. "There are officers in our department who've been operating outside the boundaries of proper procedure. Rourke is one of them." Lydia leaned forward. "And what exactly are you doing about it?" "Building a case," Keegan replied. "These things take time. Evidence needs to be gathered carefully. The right procedures followed. Meanwhile, innocent people remain convicted," Elijah said. The waitress returned with their drinks. The conversation paused as steam rose from the coffee cups. When she left, Keegan continued. "I understand you've been gathering information, talking to people who've had encounters with Rourke." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "You've been watching us?" "Let's just say word gets around." Keegan took a sip of his coffee. "I'm here because I think we could help each other. You have access to people who might not talk to me. I have access to internal documents that could strengthen whatever case you're building." "What's in it for you?" Lydia asked bluntly. Keegan smiled slightly. "I believe in doing my job properly. Internal Affairs exists to maintain integrity." "Then why hasn't anything been done about Rourke before now?" Elijah asked. "These situations are complicated." Keegan's voice remained even. "There are relationships within the department, loyalties, politics." "You mean corruption?" Lydia said. Keegan didn't flinch. "I mean obstacles, ones I've been navigating carefully." Elijah studied the man's face. "You're suggesting we share what we've found with you?" "I'm suggesting we pool our resources, for mutual benefit." Keegan leaned forward. "I can offer you protection. Make sure no one interferes with what you're doing." "Protection from whom, exactly?" Lydia asked. "Are you saying there are others who might try to stop us?" Keegan's eyes flickered briefly. "All I'm saying is that Rourke has friends, and some of them are in positions of influence." "Like Sheriff Brenner?" Elijah asked. The slight tightening around Keegan's eyes told Elijah he'd hit a nerve. "I'm not naming names," Keegan replied carefully. "But you're not wrong to look higher up the chain." "So, what exactly are you proposing?" Elijah asked. "Share what you have. I'll share what I have. We keep each other informed. I can make sure certain doors stay open for you." Keegan slid a business card across the table. "My personal number. Call any time." Lydia didn't reach for it. "And if we decide not to work with you? Then we continue our separate investigations." Keegan shrugged. "But things might move more slowly. For both of us." The conversation felt like a chess match to Elijah. Keegan was revealing just enough to appear cooperative without committing to specifics. "I'll consider your offer," Elijah said finally, taking the card. "That's all I ask." Keegan drained his coffee cup and stood. "For what it's worth, Judge, what happened to you shouldn't have happened. And I intend to make sure there are consequences." He laid a few dollars on the table for the coffee and nodded goodbye. Elijah and Lydia watched him walk through the diner and out the door. The bell above the entrance jingled as it closed behind him. "What do you think?" Elijah asked, turning to his daughter. Lydia's eyes remained fixed on the door. "I think he measured every word. Gave us just enough to seem helpful without actually committing to anything." She turned to her father. "He knows more than he's saying." That evening, Elijah drove back to his hotel, while Lydia stayed behind to organize the evidence they'd collected. The sunset painted the sky in deep oranges and reds, casting long shadows across the parking lot as he pulled in. He slowed the car, something catching his eye. A dark sedan sat idling 3 spaces away, its windows tinted just beyond what was legal. The driver's silhouette remained motionless, facing Elijah's direction. Elijah parked deliberately, taking his time gathering his briefcase. The sedan's engine continued running. He glanced at it again as he walked toward the hotel entrance, memorizing the license plate without making it obvious he was looking. The hotel lobby was quiet. Elijah nodded to the receptionist and headed for the elevator, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. The encounter with Keegan had left him uneasy. The man had been too smooth, too careful with his words. When Elijah reached his floor, he walked down the hallway, keycard in hand. He paused before his door, noticing something immediately. The "Do Not Disturb" sign he'd left hanging was now gone. He was certain he'd placed it there this morning. He slid the keycard into the lock, pushing the door open slowly. The room appeared normal at first glance. Bed still made, curtains drawn as he'd left them. But Elijah's trained eye caught the subtle differences. His briefcase from yesterday wasn't at the exact angle he'd left it. The papers on the desk were stacked too neatly, not in the slightly messy pile he'd left behind. Someone had been in his room. Elijah didn't rush. He moved methodically, checking drawers and closets. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the invasion was clear. His case notes had been disturbed, the folders not quite in the order he'd arranged them. They hadn't even tried to hide their snooping. His phone buzzed with a text from Lydia. "Check your email now." Elijah opened his laptop, clicking on the new message. It contained a single photo, Lydia's car with all 4 tires slashed. The subject line read, "Back off." He called her immediately. "I'm fine," she answered before he could speak. "But they're playing hardball now." "Where are you?" Elijah asked, keeping his voice calm despite the anger rising in his chest. "Still at the coffee shop. I called a rideshare. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Be careful. I think someone searched my room." "They're trying to scare us," Lydia said, her voice firm. "It means we're on to something. I saw a car watching the hotel, too. Description? Dark sedan, tinted windows. I got the license plate." He recited the number to her. "I'll run it when I get there." The determination in her voice matched his own. Elijah hung up and continued examining the room. In the bathroom, his toiletry bag had been moved slightly. They'd been thorough. 20 minutes later, Lydia knocked on his door. Her face was flushed with anger, but her eyes were clear and focused. 4 new tires will cost me $800, she said, tossing her bag onto the bed. But I've got more important news. 2 more victims agreed to talk. Despite the break-in, despite the threats, Elijah felt a surge of hope. Tell me. Lydia pulled out her notebook. Marcus Williams, arrested 3 years ago. Claims Rourke pulled him over for a broken taillight that wasn't actually broken. Searched his car without permission, then found drugs in the trunk. Let me guess, he took a plea deal? 5 years probation. Lost his job as a result. Lydia flipped the page. Then there's Teresa Ramirez. Single mother. Was driving home from a late shift. Rourke claimed she swerved. Breathalyzer came back negative, but he insisted on a search anyway. Conveniently found prescription pills without a prescription bottle. What happened to her case? Still pending, but she's terrified. Has 2 kids and can't risk jail time. Lydia looked up. Each story matches the pattern. Unlawful stops, suspicious evidence discoveries, pressure to accept pleas. Elijah paced the room, the familiar judicial calm giving way to growing outrage. We're building a case, but we need more. Direct evidence of tampering. I know. Lydia looked at her phone as another message came in. She went pale. What is it? Elijah asked. She turned the screen toward him. A photo of them in the diner with Keegan, clearly taken from outside. The text read, "Choosing sides is dangerous." They're watching us, she said quietly. Yes, Elijah replied. And they're worried. They worked for another hour, mapping connections between cases, noting the officers involved. Patterns emerged. The same judges handling these cases, the same prosecutors. The web stretched wider than just Rourke or even Sheriff Brenner. Night deepened outside the window. Occasionally, car headlights swept across the parking lot, and each time Elijah glanced out, wondering if the sedan had returned. When they finally stopped for the night, exhaustion setting in, Elijah walked Lydia to her room 2 doors down. They agreed to meet early, before anyone might be watching. Be careful, she said, hugging him tightly. You too. Elijah returned to his room, double-checking the locks on both the door and windows. He drew the curtains fully closed, then pushed a chair against the door handle, an old trick from his early days as a prosecutor. Standing in the darkened room, Elijah felt the weight of what they'd uncovered. Someone was willing to threaten a federal judge and his daughter. The stakes were clearly higher than a single corrupt officer. He settled into bed, but didn't sleep, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. They were being watched. They were being targeted. And tomorrow, they would push back harder. The next morning arrived with a gray dawn, as if the sky itself carried the weight of what they were uncovering. Elijah woke with a start when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He'd barely slept, his mind churning through the evidence they'd collected. The screen showed an unknown number. Judge Grant, he answered, his voice rough with fatigue. I need to talk to you. The voice was male, hushed and nervous. About what happened to you. About other things. Elijah sat up straight. Who is this? Someone inside. I can't say more on the phone. Meet me at Riverside Park, near the old boathouse. 8 o'clock. How do I know this isn't a trap? Elijah asked, but the line had already gone dead. He immediately called Lydia's room. She answered on the first ring. I was about to call you, she said. I've been up since 5 going through these files. We just got a call. Someone from inside the department wants to meet. 30 minutes later, they sat in Elijah's car, parked at the edge of Riverside Park. The morning mist hung low over the empty playground and walking paths. I don't like this, Lydia said, scanning the area. It's too exposed. We need what he might have, Elijah replied. But we'll be careful. They spotted him before he saw them, a uniformed officer pacing nervously by the boathouse, looking over his shoulder every few seconds. Young, maybe early 30s, with close-cropped hair and the rigid posture of someone who followed rules. "That's Officer Wilson," Lydia whispered. "I saw his name on some of the reports." They approached slowly, making sure he saw them coming. When he noticed them, he quickly looked around before gesturing them toward a picnic table partially hidden by trees. "I shouldn't be here," he said immediately, his hands shaking slightly. "If they find out." "No one followed us," Elijah assured him. "Why did you call?" Wilson took a deep breath. "What happened to you at that gas station? It wasn't random. Rourke has a list." "A list?" Lydia asked. "Profiles. People to watch for, stop if possible. Nice cars with out-of-town plates, especially with—" He hesitated. "With black drivers," Elijah finished for him. Wilson nodded. "But it's bigger than just racial profiling. There's a system." He pulled a USB drive from his pocket. "I copied these files last night. Evidence logs altered after the fact. Dashcam footage that mysteriously disappears when it doesn't match reports. Body cam malfunctions during certain arrests." Elijah took the drive, feeling its weight, physical and metaphorical, in his palm. "Why are you doing this?" Wilson looked down. "I joined to help people. This isn't what I signed up for. And when I heard they targeted a federal judge—" He shook his head. "It's gone too far." "Sheriff Brenner, is he involved?" Lydia asked. "Involved? He runs it." Wilson's voice hardened. "Nothing happens without his approval. The targets, the quotas, the evidence handling. It all goes through him." He pulled out a small notebook and handed it to them. "These are dates and cases I remember personally. Times when I was ordered to change reports, or when evidence appeared that I know wasn't there during the initial search." Elijah flipped through the notebook, recognizing some of the names from their own investigation. "This is exactly what we need," he said quietly. "There's more," Wilson said, leaning closer. "Some of these arrests, the bigger ones, they're coordinated with the DA's office beforehand. They know who they want, then find reasons to get them." "Targeted prosecutions," Lydia whispered. "My God!" Wilson stood suddenly. "I need to get back before I'm missed. There's one more thing you should know. They're watching you. Both of you. The sheriff has officers keeping tabs on your movements." "We noticed," Elijah said grimly. "Be careful with that information," Wilson said, nodding toward the USB drive. "If they know I gave it to you—" "They won't," Lydia assured him. "We'll protect your identity." As Wilson walked away, his shoulders tense with fear, Elijah and Lydia returned to the car. "This is it," Lydia said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "This is everything we need. Documented proof of systematic corruption, direct orders, pattern of behavior. All of it." Back in Elijah's hotel room, they immediately began reviewing the files. The evidence was damning. Internal emails directing officers to target specific individuals, logs showing evidence added hours after arrests, and Sheriff Brenner's signature on dozens of falsified reports. "Look at this," Lydia said, pointing at an email thread. "Brenner specifically instructs officers to find reasons to stop certain vehicles. This isn't random harassment, it's coordinated targeting." Elijah felt a complex mix of emotions: vindication that his suspicions were correct, but horror at the scope of the corruption. The system he'd served for decades had been manipulated in ways he couldn't have imagined. "We need to take this to the federal prosecutor's office," he said. "This goes beyond local jurisdiction." Lydia was already organizing the evidence, creating a timeline of abuses. "We'll need sworn statements from the victims. Wilson's testimony will be crucial if he's willing." "He's taking an enormous risk," Elijah said. "We need to move quickly, before they realize what he's done." For the first time since the incident at the gas station, Elijah felt hope rising. The path forward was clear. The evidence was solid. The pattern undeniable. Justice was within reach. "We can stop them," Lydia said, determination hardening her voice. "We can actually stop them." Elijah nodded, feeling the familiar certainty that came with a solid case. "Yes, we can." Later that same day, Elijah and Lydia were working through lunch, organizing evidence for their meeting with federal prosecutors scheduled for tomorrow morning. The television hummed quietly in the background when suddenly Lydia froze. "Dad," she said, her voice tight. "Look." On screen, Officer Wilson stood at a podium, cameras flashing around him. His face was pale, eyes darting nervously as Sheriff Brenner stood just behind his right shoulder. A steady hand placed there in what appeared to be support, but looked more like control. "I need to clarify statements I may have made regarding the Sheriff's Department," Wilson said, reading stiffly from a paper. "Any documents I provided to Judge Grant were taken out of context or misunderstood. I was under emotional distress following personal issues, and Judge Grant took advantage of my vulnerable state." Elijah stood slowly, disbelief washing over him. "This is absurd," he whispered. Wilson continued, his voice robotic. "No systemic issues exist within our department. Any suggestion of evidence tampering or procedural violations is completely false. I deeply regret my actions and the confusion they've caused." Sheriff Brenner stepped forward, his face a mask of concerned authority. "We understand Officer Wilson was going through a difficult time. Judge Grant's aggressive pursuit of baseless accusations pressured an officer already in distress. We're supporting Wilson through this difficult period and hope Judge Grant will cease this harassment campaign." Lydia frantically opened her laptop. "The files," she said, typing quickly. "They're gone. Everything on the drive is corrupted." Elijah felt the floor shift beneath him. "That's impossible. We made copies." "All corrupted. Every single file." Lydia looked up, face pale. "Someone got to our backups." Within hours, the story was everywhere. Local news ran segments questioning Elijah's motives. "Federal judge on crusade against local law enforcement," read one headline. "Judge's personal vendetta after traffic stop?" asked another. By late afternoon, Elijah's phone rang. It was the chief judge from his district. "Elijah," his colleague said, voice heavy. "There's no easy way to say this. The Judicial Ethics Committee has received a formal complaint about your conduct." "What complaint?" Elijah asked, though he already knew. "Sheriff Brenner claims you're using your position to intimidate officers and fabricate evidence against his department. They've submitted sworn statements from Officer Wilson that you pressured him into providing falsified documents." "That's preposterous," Elijah said. "I've done nothing." "There's more," the chief judge interrupted. "They're calling for a review of your past rulings, claiming bias against law enforcement. The media's already digging into your case history." Elijah sat down heavily. "This is retaliation. You must see that." "I don't know what to see anymore, Elijah. But until this is resolved, you're being placed on administrative leave." After hanging up, Elijah tried repeatedly to reach Captain Keegan. Each call went straight to voicemail. "He's gone," Lydia said grimly, after making her own inquiries. "No one at Internal Affairs will even acknowledge he was assigned to any investigation involving Rourke or the department." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Keegan had never been on their side. He'd been Brenner's eyes and ears, tracking their investigation, reporting back what they'd discovered, who they'd spoken with, every conversation, every lead they'd shared. It had all gone straight to Brenner. "We've been played," Elijah said, the bitter truth settling in his stomach like lead. By evening, the damage was catastrophic. News outlets were running segments questioning Elijah's entire judicial career. Cases he'd presided over were being scrutinized, His impartiality called into doubt. A lifetime of careful, principled work was being dismantled in hours. His phone buzzed with a formal email from the Judicial Ethics Committee. The complaint had escalated. Facing such serious allegations, he was being asked to voluntarily step down pending investigation. "You can't resign," Lydia insisted. "That's exactly what they want." But Elijah knew the damage was done. Fighting would only prolong the spectacle, drag his reputation further through the mud, and potentially harm the court itself. With leaden fingers, he typed his response, agreeing to step aside. That night, Elijah sat alone in his hotel room, the television off, his phone silenced. Decades of service, thousands of cases, a reputation built on fairness and integrity, all of it crumbling around him. The darkness of the room matched his mood as he struggled to comprehend how completely they had outmaneuvered him. He'd spent his life believing in the system, in the power of evidence and truth to prevail. Now that same system had been weaponized against him with devastating efficiency. Every move he and Lydia had made had been anticipated, countered, and turned against them. In the silence, a terrible realization settled over him. To fight this, he would need to step outside the system he'd served his entire life. The rules he'd lived by wouldn't protect him now. They would only constrain him while his enemies operated without such limitations. Early the next morning, Elijah sat alone in his hotel room, curtains half drawn, the weight of disgrace pressing in as sunlight cut across a table cluttered with scattered files and a silent phone. The room felt smaller today, closing in around him. His judicial robe hung in the closet, a reminder of everything he'd lost in just a few days. He hadn't slept. The accusations played on repeat in his mind, each one more damaging than the last. Bias, misconduct, abuse of power. The very things he'd spent a lifetime fighting against were now attached to his name like a brand. The television in the corner droned quietly. He couldn't bear to turn it off, couldn't stop punishing himself with each new report. Questions about dozens of cases presided over by Judge Grant, particularly those involving law enforcement testimony. Sources close to the investigation suggest a pattern of favorable rulings. Judicial Review Board expected to launch a formal inquiry into... Elijah reached for the remote and turned up the volume, a twisted form of self-torture. The reporter's face filled the screen, her expression professionally concerned as she stood outside the courthouse where he had worked for 15 years. Judge Elijah Grant's reputation has collapsed virtually overnight, with legal experts questioning how this will impact cases he has ruled on in recent years. A sharp knock interrupted the broadcast. The door opened before he could answer, and Lydia strode in, bringing with her a blast of energy that seemed out of place in his cloud of defeat. "Turn that garbage off," she said, snatching the remote and silencing the television. Her eyes scanned the room, the untouched food tray, the rumpled bed sheets, the scattered papers, and then settled on her father. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. "Thank you for that assessment," Elijah replied, his voice hollow. Lydia set down her bag and crossed her arms. "Are you finished feeling sorry for yourself? Because we have work to do." Elijah gestured weakly at the silent television. "What work? It's over, Lydia. They won." "Over?" Her eyebrows shot up. "They strip away your title and suddenly you forget who you are? The man who taught me that truth matters more than comfort?" "This isn't about comfort," he snapped, frustration finally breaking through the numbness. "This is about reality. They've destroyed my credibility. Anything I say now will be dismissed as the desperate claims of a disgraced judge." Lydia pulled out her phone and tapped the screen a few times. "You need to watch this again." She placed it in front of him. The gas station video filled the screen. "I've seen it," he said, turning away. No. Watch it again. She pressed play. Not as a judge. Not as a victim. Watch it as if you're seeing a stranger being humiliated for no reason except the color of his skin and the car he drives. The footage began to play. Officer Rourke's voice filled the room, harsh and accusatory. How exactly did someone like you get a car like this? Elijah's own voice, calm and dignified. I purchased it, officer. The escalation was rapid. The surrounding of the car, the backup arriving, the public search, the phones recording, each moment of degradation captured in high definition. Look at your face there, Lydia said, pausing the video at the moment when the officers finally received confirmation of who he was. That's not just embarrassment. That's the face of a man seeing a system he believed in fail completely. Elijah stared at his own frozen image. She was right. He remembered exactly what he'd been thinking in that moment. How many others had stood where he stood without his credentials to save them? They can take your robe, Lydia said, her voice softer now. They can take your bench, but they can't take this. She tapped the screen. This is truth. Raw, undeniable truth. Elijah nodded slowly, feeling something stir inside him. Not quite hope, but something close to it. Determination, perhaps. What do you propose we do? He asked. We release the footage, all of it. Not just to some newspaper that might bury it, but everywhere. Social media. Every platform. We include the witness statements we've gathered, the pattern of stops we've documented. The backlash will be severe, Elijah warned. Sheriff Brenner has powerful friends. This won't just go away because we post a video. I'm not saying it will be easy, Lydia replied. But right now, they're controlling the narrative. They've made this about you, your credibility, your motives. This puts the focus back where it belongs, on their actions. Elijah stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain fully open. Sunlight flooded the room, harsh and revealing. For a moment, he thought of everything he would be leaving behind. The respect of colleagues, the security of his position, the comfortable identity he'd worn for decades. But what good was any of it if he couldn't stand for what was right? He turned back to Lydia. If we do this, there's no going back to how things were. Some things shouldn't go back to how they were, she replied. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Elijah nodded. The weight on his shoulders didn't lift, but it shifted. This wasn't about saving his career anymore. It was about something far more important. Let's do it, he said. They sat side by side at the small hotel table. Lydia's laptop open between them. She pulled up the video file, added the supporting documents they'd gathered, and prepared it for release, choosing truth over fear. Lydia's finger hovered over the publish button, trembling slightly. Their entire investigation, the video, supporting documents, and personal testimony, all compiled into one explosive package. Ready? She asked, glancing at her father. Elijah took a deep breath and nodded. Do it. She pressed down firmly, committing their evidence to the world. The screen refreshed, showing their post was now live across multiple platforms. That's it, she said quietly. Now we wait. For the first 15 minutes, nothing happened. The view counter barely ticked upward. Elijah paced the hotel room, checking his phone every few seconds. Had they misjudged? Would anyone care about yet another injustice? Give it time, Lydia said, though uncertainty tinged her voice. Then, as if a dam had broken, notifications began flooding in. First a trickle, then a torrent. Look at this, Lydia said, pointing to the rapidly climbing view counter. 1,000. 5,000. The numbers jumped again. 20,000 views already. Elijah leaned over her shoulder, watching in astonishment. It's working. On screen, the comments section exploded with reactions. This is exactly what happened to my brother last year. I know that officer. Rourke pulled me over for looking suspicious, too. A federal judge. If they treat him like this, imagine what happens to the rest of us. Within an hour, their post had been shared more than 50,000 times. Major social media accounts with millions of followers were reposting the video. Hashtags formed organically. Royce, Judge Grant. Police accountability. It could be you. Dad, look. Lydia turned her laptop toward him. A major news network was already playing the footage. The anchor's expression grave as she described, disturbing video of a federal judge being racially profiled at a gas station. Elijah sat heavily on the edge of the bed. I never thought it would spread this fast. His phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. Then Lydia's phone rang too. Then both their email inboxes began filling with notification after notification. It's journalists, Lydia said, scanning the messages. They all want statements, interviews. And these, Elijah said, holding up his phone, are from people who've experienced the same thing. Listen to this one. I was stopped by Officer Rourke 3 times in 2 weeks. The 3rd time, he planted evidence. I'm still fighting the charges. More messages poured in. People from across the country sharing their own stories, but particularly from their town. Dozens of incidents involving the same officers, the same tactics, the same department. A breaking news alert flashed across the television. The anchor looked directly into the camera. We're receiving reports that the Justice Department has opened a preliminary investigation into the police department at the center of the Judge Grant controversy. That was fast, Lydia said, eyes wide. Too fast, Elijah replied. They must have already been looking into this department. Our video just forced their hand. Outside their hotel room, they heard footsteps and voices. Lydia peeked through the peephole. Reporters, she whispered. At least a dozen of them. Elijah straightened his tie and took a deep breath. We knew this would happen. We can't hide now. His phone rang again, this time a familiar number. The chief judge of his district. Elijah answered, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Elijah, the chief judge said, I've seen the footage. Everyone has. The administrative office is issuing a statement supporting you. What was done to you was unconscionable. Relief flooded through him. Thank you. But this isn't just about me. I know. The pattern you've uncovered, it's compelling. The judicial conference is calling for a full investigation. After he hung up, Elijah turned to Lydia with amazement. The judiciary is backing us. On television, the coverage continued to spread. Legal analysts dissected every second of the video, pointing out violations of protocol, constitutional rights ignored, the clear pattern of prejudice. Sheriff Brenner appeared briefly in a hastily called press conference, sweating under the lights, insisting it was one isolated incident under investigation. But it was too late for damage control. The truth had broken free. A notification popped up on Lydia's laptop. Officer Rourke had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. It's just beginning, Elijah said, watching the storm they'd unleashed continue to build. There will be pushback, denial, attempts to discredit us. Let them try, Lydia replied. The truth is out there now. They can't put it back in the box. Elijah lowered his phone, watching the news coverage continue to unfold. After days of feeling powerless, of watching his reputation being dismantled, of seeing justice twisted, he felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. The truth had finally broken free, and it could not be contained. The following morning, the town woke to the sound of sirens. Not routine patrols, but something heavier, coordinated, undeniable. The wailing cut through the early dawn, echoing between buildings and drawing curious faces to windows and doorways. Elijah stood in his hotel room, coffee untouched, watching the news unfold live on television. The reporter's voice trembled with barely contained excitement. Breaking news this morning as federal agents descend on the sheriff's department following yesterday's viral video and subsequent allegations. "We need to see this," Lydia said, already grabbing her keys. 20 minutes later, they parked a safe distance away. The scene before them was unlike anything the small town had ever witnessed. Black SUVs and tactical vehicles surrounded the sheriff's department. Agents in navy jackets with bold yellow FBI letters moved with practiced precision, coordinating through earpieces and hand signals. Local officers stood outside, some in uniform, others clearly called in from home, their faces a mixture of confusion and growing dread. "They didn't know this was coming," Elijah said quietly. The federal operation moved with mechanical efficiency. Teams split off in different directions, some carrying equipment into the building, others setting up a perimeter. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered across the street, watching in stunned silence as their local law enforcement, untouchable for so long, was suddenly and forcefully contained. Through the department's glass doors, they could see agents moving through the building. Computers were disconnected and boxed. File cabinets were emptied. Papers were carefully sorted and sealed in evidence bags. "Look," Lydia pointed toward the side of the building where agents had discovered something unexpected. A hidden storage room, concealed behind what appeared to be a maintenance closet, was being systematically emptied. Box after box emerged, each carefully labeled and photographed before being placed in federal vehicles. "Those aren't supposed to exist," Elijah said. "Those are case files that should have been in the system." They watched as an agent carefully examined a folder, showing it to her colleague with a grim expression. Evidence that had vanished from cases. Reports that contradicted what had been presented in court. The truth, hidden away where no one was meant to find it. A commotion near the front entrance drew their attention. Officer Dale Rourke was being led out in handcuffs, flanked by 2 federal agents. His uniform was gone, replaced by casual clothes that suggested he'd been pulled from his home. The swagger that had been so evident at the gas station had vanished completely. Rourke's eyes darted frantically around the crowd, searching for allies, for escape, for anything that might save him. Finding none, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The man who had towered over Elijah with such confidence now looked small, diminished by the weight of his exposed actions. "I was just following orders," Rourke shouted to no one in particular as they placed him in a vehicle. "This isn't right. I didn't do anything wrong." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The doors closed, sealing him away. More officers followed, some in handcuffs, others simply escorted to be questioned. The department was being hollowed out before their eyes. Then, a familiar figure appeared at the entrance. Sheriff Brenner emerged, his uniform crisp as always, but his face ashen. He stood tall, attempting to project authority even now. "This is a misunderstanding," he announced loudly. "My officers have done nothing wrong. We serve this community with—" "Sheriff Brenner," an agent interrupted, "you need to come with us now." Brenner's mouth tightened into a thin line. "I'm the elected sheriff of this county. You can't just—" "We have a federal warrant," the agent said, unmoved. "Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." For a moment, it seemed Brenner might resist. His hand twitched toward his hip, where his weapon would normally be, but it had already been taken. His eyes scanned the crowd, perhaps looking for support that wasn't coming. The townspeople, many of whom had voted for him for years, simply stared back in silence. Defeat settled over him like a physical weight. Without another word, he allowed himself to be led to a waiting vehicle. Minutes later, Captain Roy Keegan appeared, escorted separately. Unlike the others, he made no protests, offered no defense. His eyes remained fixed on the ground as he was led away, the quiet betrayer finally exposed. From across the street, Elijah watched it all unfold. The morning sun illuminated a scene he had never truly believed possible. The system that had protected itself for so long, now laid bare and vulnerable. "This is only the beginning," Lydia said beside him. Elijah nodded. "But it is a beginning." Years of corruption unraveled in a single morning. Decades of unchecked power dismantled in hours. The machinery of injustice, which had ground forward for so long, finally jammed and broke apart. From across the street, Elijah watched it all unfold, knowing this was only the beginning of justice. But it was undeniable. Weeks later, the courtroom was packed, tension thick as every seat was filled, and every eye was fixed on the proceedings about to begin. Reporters squeezed into the back rows, notebooks ready. Citizens who had been wronged sat with straight backs, finally seeing their day arrive. The room hummed with whispered conversations that died instantly when the doors opened. Elijah Grant entered, his steps measured and deliberate. For decades, he had walked into courtrooms with the authority of the bench before him. Today, he entered differently. Not as a judge, but as a witness. The shift was powerful, humbling, and necessary. His daughter Lydia sat in the front row, her eyes never leaving him as he moved toward the witness stand. She had been his strength through all of this, refusing to let him back down even when everything seemed lost. "Please state your name for the record," the clerk said. "Elijah Thomas Grant." "And your occupation?" Elijah paused just for a moment. "Former federal judge." The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with decades of experience handling corruption cases, approached. "Judge Grant, can you please tell the court about the events that occurred on the afternoon of June 15th? When he began speaking, his voice was steady, clear enough to reach the back of the room without straining. He recounted every moment from the gas station to the unraveling of the department. He described Rourke's immediate hostility, the escalation, the humiliation that followed. "He demanded to know how I got that car," Elijah testified, as if the only explanation for a black man driving a Rolls-Royce was something illegal. From the defense table, Rourke shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed with anger or shame, perhaps both. Sheriff Brenner sat beside him, expressionless, staring straight ahead as if removing himself from the proceedings entirely. "And what happened when you identified yourself as a federal judge?" the prosecutor asked. "Officer Rourke said I was lying. He called for backup, claiming I was impersonating a federal official." The video was played again, this time in a courtroom that could not ignore it. The footage was larger than life on the courtroom screen, the audio capturing Rourke's contempt, his immediate assumptions, the way he circled Elijah like prey. The jury watched with unwavering attention, some wincing at particularly aggressive moments. Then came the other victims, one after another, their stories aligning with chilling consistency. A young teacher described being stopped for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. A business owner recounted how a routine traffic check turned into a search of his vehicle without consent. A college student explained how she was threatened with charges unless she cooperated. Their testimonies built upon each other, creating a pattern too clear to dismiss. What had happened to Elijah wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. It was standard practice. The defense attorneys tried to paint each incident as separate, unrelated events. They suggested misremembered details, officers following procedure, reasonable suspicion. But legal defenses crumbled under the weight of documented evidence, altered reports, and hidden files now laid bare. Captain Keegan testified as part of his plea deal, his voice barely audible as he described how reports were altered, complaints buried, and officers protected. He couldn't look at Brenner as he detailed the sheriff's instructions to handle problems before they reached the public. "And what exactly did handle problems mean?" the prosecutor asked. "It meant making evidence disappear," Keegan replied. It meant pressuring complainants to drop their cases. It meant whatever was necessary to protect the department. The courtroom became a place of reckoning, not just for individuals, but for a system forced to confront its failures. The judge, a woman with 30 years on the bench and a reputation for fairness, listened to each testimony without expression, but her questions revealed her growing concern. Halfway through the trial, 3 more officers pleaded guilty rather than face the mounting evidence against them. Their statements further implicated Brenner, describing a culture where following his orders was non-negotiable if you wanted to keep your job. One by one, verdicts were delivered. Guilty, clear, final. There was no ambiguity, no escape. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before reaching unanimous decisions on all counts. As sentences were handed down, Rourke and Brenner stood powerless, their authority gone, replaced by consequences they could no longer avoid. Rourke's face twisted with rage as the judge announced his 8-year sentence. Brenner maintained his composure, even as he received 12 years. But the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his shock. They were led away in handcuffs, the same way they had led away so many others over the years. The difference was stark. Their restraints were justified, their rights preserved, their day in court fair and transparent. Everything they had denied others. Months later, under a calm afternoon sky, Elijah stood outside the same gas station where everything began, the air now quiet, almost reflective. The concrete beneath his feet was the same. The pumps still hummed with the same mechanical rhythm. But everything else had changed. He leaned against his car, still the same Rolls-Royce that had caught Officer Rourke's attention that day, and watched people come and go. No one gave him suspicious glances. No one questioned his right to be there. The weight of that day still lived in his memory, but it no longer pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The town felt different. Not perfect, but changed. The sheriff's department had been rebuilt from the ground up under new leadership, with mandatory body cameras that couldn't be turned off and civilian oversight committees with actual power. Traffic stops required documentation of cause. Complaints were logged publicly. Officers with multiple infractions were investigated, not protected. These weren't revolutionary ideas. They were simply the way things should have been all along. Elijah watched a mother fill her tank while her children waited in the car. She didn't look over her shoulder or tense up when a patrol car passed on the main road. Small changes, but meaningful ones. He thought back to the trials, the testimonies, the long process of dragging truth into the light. Dozens of cases had been reopened, convictions overturned, lives restored as much as they could be after years of injustice. Former Sheriff Brenner and Officer Rourke were still serving their sentences, along with 5 other officers from the department. Captain Keegan had received a reduced sentence for his testimony, but he would still serve 4 years. The whistleblower officer had been reinstated after evidence proved he had been threatened into retracting his statement. Elijah sighed deeply, breathing in the warm afternoon air. He looked at the spot where he once stood surrounded, remembering the weight of that moment and how close it came to being buried. If not for the bystander who had slipped him the phone with the recording, if not for Lydia's determination, if not for their refusal to back down even when it seemed hopeless, none of this change would have happened. 2 weeks ago, he had received a letter from the Judicial Council. He had been offered reinstatement, a return to the bench, and the life he once knew. His reputation had been restored, his actions vindicated. He could go back, pick up his gavel, and continue as if the interruption had been nothing more than a pause in his career. But he had declined. The letter sat on his desk at home, his polite but firm response already sent. Judge Elijah Grant would not be returning to the federal bench. Instead, he and Lydia had built something new, a foundation dedicated to exposing misconduct and protecting those without power. They called it the Witness Project, inspired by that anonymous bystander who had the courage to record what was happening. They provided legal support to people filing complaints against law enforcement, connected them with attorneys willing to work pro bono, and helped them navigate a system designed to wear them down. Their first office had opened 2 months ago, and they were already working at capacity. Lydia handled most of the day-to-day operations, while Elijah focused on fundraising and speaking to community groups about recognizing and reporting misconduct. What began as humiliation had transformed into purpose. Elijah checked his watch. Lydia would be arriving soon. They had a meeting with the new police chief, a woman brought in from outside who had made community accountability her priority. It wasn't an adversarial relationship, but a cautious partnership built on clear boundaries and shared goals. The gas station, once a symbol of injustice, now stood as a reminder of what happens when truth refuses to stay hidden. Elijah had chosen this spot for their meeting deliberately. Sometimes healing required returning to the place where the wound began. A patrol car pulled into the gas station, moving at a casual pace. Elijah straightened slightly, an old instinct not entirely gone. The cruiser parked near the store entrance, and an officer stepped out. He was young, probably new to the force since the department overhaul. The officer noticed Elijah and paused. Recognition flickered across his face. Elijah's story was required reading now at the academy, part of the ethics training that had been completely revamped. The officer nodded with quiet respect. Elijah returned the nod, not as a victim, but as a man who forced justice into the light. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.